They told you from the very beginning that the story of Jesus was the single greatest truth in history, the one figure who divided time, who embodied salvation, who turned the world upside down. But what if I told you that this entire foundation is built on 10 lies so colossal, so deeply entrenched, that once exposed, they prove not only that Jesus as we know him never existed, but that powerful institutions worked tirelessly to keep you from ever questioning it. And in this first block, we rip open the veil, beginning with the explosive lie that the historical existence of Jesus has ever been proven, because despite centuries of teaching you that the evidence is solid, the reality is that there is no contemporary record of this man, no Roman document, no Jewish census, no governmental decree, no inscription, no coin, no artifact, nothing from the 1st century when he supposedly walked the earth, and yet the world has been conditioned to accept his existence as if it were undeniable. Fact, so why is that? Why does the figure who supposedly performed miracles, moved crowds, defied empires, and was executed in a public spectacle, leave not a single shred of evidence from those who lived during his lifetime? Is that not the first and greatest red flag? Because if you pause and think, the Romans were notorious record keepers. They documented everything from battles to minor disputes, yet silence on Jesus. The Jewish historians chronicled their struggles, their leaders, their prophets, yet silence on Jesus. And the most cited name, Josephus, who allegedly confirmed him, has been shown by scholars to be a later forgery inserted by church scribes, desperate to legitimize their myth, a forgery that cracks under textual analysis. And so lie number 1 is the supposed historical certainty of Jesus, a certainty that collapses when you realize the silence of those who should have noticed him is deafening, and this silence screams louder than any fabricated testimony. But it goes further, because the institutions will tell you that we have writings from Paul, early epistles confirming Jesus. But did you ever realize that Paul never once speaks of an earthly Jesus, never once references his miracles, never once locates him in Galilee or Nazareth? Paul speaks only of a celestial figure, visions, revelations, a cosmic Christ, not a man of flesh and blood. So even the earliest so-called witness does not confirm his existence on earth, and yet entire doctrines are built on twisting Paul into proof of a human figure. Do you not see the magnitude of this manipulation? And from here we can reflect on something chilling. If Jesus had truly existed, why did those closest in time to him leave no trace? Why do we find ourselves relying on documents written decades later, documents edited, redacted, and canonized under imperial authority? And does that not sound more like myth-making than biography? Think about it. Myths grow in the gaps where no evidence exists. And what greater gap could there be than the 30 to 60 years after Jesus supposedly died? A void, filled not with history, but with invention. And once you accept this first lie, you start to see the cracks in the foundation, the unsettling realization that billions were taught to accept a man as real when his existence is no more historically proven than Hercules or Osiris. But the lie persists, because if Jesus is shown to be a myth, the entire edifice of power collapses. The churches, the dogmas, the empires that ruled in his name, all of it crumbles. And so they hid it, they burned records, they silenced dissenters, they executed those who dared to say Jesus was a fabrication, and they still condition you to believe without questioning. But right now you are questioning, and that is the first step. Because the truth is that the silence of history is the loudest proof of all, the first of 10 lies designed to keep you in submission. And if this realization already makes you uneasy, ask yourself what it means for the next lies. Ask yourself if you are ready to face the possibility that everything you thought was sacred is part of a carefully constructed illusion meant to control you, to manipulate entire civilizations, and to keep you from ever discovering your own power outside of their narrative. And with that, the first block closes, tearing away the illusion of evidence, showing you that the man they told you about has no anchor in history, and reminding you that we are only beginning this investigation because 9 more lies await that will shatter the illusion further and leave you unable to ever see the story of Jesus in the same way again. The second lie they never wanted you to uncover is that the Gospels are eyewitness testimonies, because from the very beginning of Sunday school or catechism, you were likely told that Matthew was a disciple, Mark a companion of Peter, Luke a physician traveling with Paul, and John the beloved disciple, all writing down what they saw with their own eyes, as if these 4 books were 4 independent confirmations of a real man who walked, preached, performed miracles, and was crucified, but once. You scratch beneath the surface, you discover that none of this is true. Not one gospel was written by an eyewitness. Not one author claims to have seen Jesus with his own eyes. Not one of them identifies themselves directly. The names Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John were attached decades later by church authority to give credibility to anonymous writings. And worse still, these texts were not written in the land of Israel by Aramaic-speaking Jews, but in Greek, by writers far removed in time and place from the supposed events, at least 40 to 70 years after the crucifixion, which means the stories were passed down orally, shaped by communities, exaggerated, mythologized, and then finally written down not as history, but as theology, as propaganda to convert and to control. So the second lie is the myth of eyewitness testimony, because when you open the pages expecting a record, you are reading anonymous storytelling meant to persuade, not to document. And you might ask, how can billions base their faith on writings that never claim to be historical accounts? The answer lies in centuries of conditioning, where questioning was forbidden, where even suggesting the Gospels were not eyewitness accounts could mean death. But once you admit this, the illusion begins to collapse even further. And it is not just anonymity, because the texts themselves contradict each other in ways no eyewitnesses ever would. One gospel has Jesus born in Bethlehem because of a census. Another, because of prophecy. One says his ministry lasted a single year. Another stretches it over 3. One describes the women finding the tomb guarded by soldiers. Another says it was empty. One has him ascending into heaven immediately. Another says it happened later. And these contradictions are brushed aside as mysteries of faith, but in any other context, they would expose fabrication. So what are we to do with this, if 4 so-called witnesses cannot agree on the most basic facts? Are we looking at reliable testimony, or are we seeing competing legends stitched together? And here is the deeper question: why did they need 4 versions at all? If one disciple had truly witnessed and written down what happened, would that not have been enough? But instead we have 4 conflicting accounts and dozens more Gospels that were rejected, suppressed, and burned by the church because they did not fit the narrative, which means the version you hold in your hand is not the truth, but the winner of a political struggle, a curated selection chosen to uphold power. And every time you were told that these are eyewitnesses, you were being lied to, because scholars, even devout Christian scholars, admit the anonymity, the late dating, the contradictions, and yet the faithful are taught not to look too closely, not to compare, not to see the cracks, because once you see them, the illusion shatters, and you realize you have been reading not history, but mythology, presented as fact. And then you start asking more dangerous questions. If the Gospels are not history, what are they? Are they rewritten myths from older traditions? Are they allegories meant to convey theology rather than biography? Are they simply propaganda? And when you trace their themes, you find echoes of Greek hero stories, of Egyptian savior gods, of Persian myths of dying and rising figures, all recycled, rebranded, and sold to you as eyewitness truth. And this is where the lie becomes truly manipulative. Because when communities asked questions, they were told faith was required, that doubt was sinful, and in doing so the church ensured that billions would accept anonymous, contradictory writings as the ultimate proof of Jesus, when in reality they prove the opposite. They prove invention, imagination, and control. And I ask you now, how does it feel to realize that the stories you were told to treat as sacred history are in fact anonymous Greek writings from decades later? How does it feel to see that you were handed propaganda wrapped in the illusion of testimony? And what does it say about the institutions that still demand your loyalty when their foundation is built on deception? Pause and reflect on that, because once you admit this lie, you cannot unknow it. You cannot go back to seeing the Gospels as you did before. They are no longer sacred records, they are myth-making tools, and if that realization shakes you, remember, we are only 2 lies in, with 8 more to go that will dig even deeper into the fabric of belief and show you how thoroughly this narrative was constructed, protected, and weaponized against you. So brace yourself, because the next lie will reveal how even the supposed miracles of Jesus follow a pattern older than Christianity itself, a pattern borrowed, copied, and disguised as unique, when in truth they prove once again that the story was never history at all. The third lie that has been repeated so many times you might have accepted it without hesitation is that the miracles of Jesus prove his divinity and therefore his existence, because in every church, in every sermon, you are told that no ordinary man could have walked on water, multiplied loaves, healed the blind, calmed storms, or risen from the dead. But if you take a step back and look at history with clear eyes, you will realize that none of these stories were unique. They were recycled from older mythologies and rebranded to give credibility to a savior figure who needed to look extraordinary. So when you hear of Jesus turning water into wine, you are hearing echoes of Dionysus, the Greek god who was worshipped centuries earlier and who was said to perform the exact same feat. When you hear of Jesus feeding the multitudes, you are hearing the old tales of Elisha in the Hebrew scriptures, who fed 100 men with a few loaves. When you hear of healing the blind and the lame, you are encountering the timeless archetypes of divine healers found in Egyptian, Persian, and Greco-Roman traditions, all of which predate Christianity. And when you hear of resurrection, you are hearing one of the oldest myths humanity has told, whether Osiris in Egypt, Tammuz in Babylon, or Mithras in Persia, dying and rising gods long before the Gospels were written. So the lie is that the miracles are proof, when in fact they are the opposite. They are literary borrowings, mythological templates, designed not to record history, but to persuade readers steeped in the myths of the time. And once you realize that the miracles are not unique, the illusion of divinity begins to crumble, because if these feats were performed by countless savior figures before Jesus, then what proof is there that they happened at all? And if they did not happen, what proof is left that Jesus even walked the earth? But the manipulation goes deeper, because when you are told these miracles were witnessed by crowds, ask yourself, where are the records of those crowds? Where are the testimonies, the inscriptions, the Roman accounts of thousands fed by a single meal? These are nowhere to be found, and instead you are left with stories written decades later, echoing older myths, sold as new truth. And when skeptics pointed this out across history, they were silenced, their works burned, their voices erased, so that only the Church's narrative would survive. But even within the Gospels you see inconsistencies that scream fabrication, because in one account Jesus heals with a word, in another with spit. In one Gospel he raises a child in secret, in another he raises Lazarus before a crowd. And yet, strangely, the most dramatic miracle of all, the raising of Lazarus, is not mentioned in the earliest Gospel, Mark, which suggests it was a later invention to make the story even more spectacular. Do you not see the pattern? The myth grows bigger with time, the miracles become grander, the spectacle intensifies. And this is exactly how legends are born, not how history is written, and the Church capitalized on this, turning miracle stories into proof of authority, demanding that believers accept the supernatural as fact, while punishing those who dared to ask simple questions like, where is the evidence? But you are asking that question right now, and the answer is devastating. There is none. The miracles are literary devices, borrowed myths, theological propaganda, and when you accept this, you realize that what was presented to you as the very proof of Jesus is in fact proof of myth-making, and here lies the emotional sting, because for millions, these miracles were a source of hope, a promise that suffering would end, that death would not have the final word, and yet this hope was built on recycled stories passed off as new revelation. And when you see that, you start to feel both betrayed and liberated. Betrayed because you were misled, liberated because the chains of myth no longer hold you. And so I ask you, what does it mean if the miracles never happened? If they were never proof of divinity but evidence of plagiarism? It means that the cornerstone of belief has been hollow all along. And once the miracles are gone, what remains of Jesus, what remains of his uniqueness, his existence, his authority? Nothing but a story among countless others, a story polished and weaponized to dominate empires and minds alike. And this brings us to the deeper truth that the miracles were never about proving Jesus existed, but about creating a character that people could not resist following, a divine man who outshone the older gods by stealing their best tricks. And if that realization unsettles you, let it, because this is how illusions are broken, through discomfort, through facing the evidence, and through the courage to admit that what billions accepted as divine truth is just another recycled myth wearing a new mask. So the third lie falls, the lie of miracles as proof, and with it, another brick of the foundation collapses. But there are still 7 more lies to confront, each one peeling away another layer of the deception, each one bringing us closer to the final devastating conclusion that the figure of Jesus was not a man of history, but a fabrication of power, myth, and control. So stay with me, because the next lie will show you how even the supposed prophecies of the Old Testament that were said to prove Jesus were never prophecies at all but twisted interpretations and deliberate mistranslations crafted to fit a narrative that never existed in the first place. The fourth lie they drilled into you from the pulpit and the Bible study group is that Jesus fulfilled ancient prophecies, that his life was written about hundreds of years before he was born, that his virgin birth, his birthplace, his betrayal, his crucifixion, and even his resurrection were foretold by the Hebrew prophets. But once you take a closer look, you realize something shocking. Not one of these so-called prophecies was ever about Jesus. They were ripped out of context, mistranslated, and twisted to fit a story that had already been constructed. And the most famous example of this manipulation is the claim that Isaiah predicted a virgin would conceive, a verse that became the cornerstone for the story of the virgin birth. Yet, in the original Hebrew text, the word is not virgin at all but young woman, and it was only when the Hebrew was mistranslated into Greek centuries later that the word became virgin, giving Christian writers the opening they needed to create a miraculous birth out of an ordinary phrase. This is not prophecy fulfilled, this is mistranslation exploited, and the betrayal runs deeper, because Matthew in particular combs through the Hebrew scriptures, desperate to find lines that could be rebranded as predictions of Jesus. He claims that Jesus was born in Bethlehem to fulfill prophecy, yet the verse he cites was never about a future Messiah, but about a political leader of his own time. He claims that Jesus being taken to Egypt fulfilled another prophecy, yet the text he quotes in Hosea was about Israel as a nation, not a future savior. Again and again we see this pattern, lifting verses out of their context, twisting their meaning, and selling them to the faithful as proof. But if these were truly prophecies of Jesus, why do Jewish scholars who know their scriptures better than anyone reject them entirely? The answer is clear, because they were never prophecies of Jesus in the first place. They were retrofitted by gospel writers to give legitimacy to a character they were inventing. And this should make you pause, because prophecy is supposed to be evidence that God himself planned the coming of Christ. Yet what we see is evidence of human manipulation, writers backfilling stories to match passages that never spoke of him, and one of the most damning examples is the 30 pieces of silver. Matthew says Judas betrayed Jesus for 30 silver coins to fulfill a prophecy, but he misquotes the source, attributing it to Jeremiah when it actually comes from Zechariah, and even then the passage is not a prophecy, but a symbolic act in a different story entirely. This is not fulfillment, this is fabrication, and when you realize that so much of the Jesus story is built on this kind of scriptural distortion, you begin to understand how carefully orchestrated this deception was, because by creating the illusion that Jesus fulfilled prophecy, the writers could present him as the long-awaited Messiah, even though the texts themselves said no such thing. And this realization forces a devastating question. If Jesus did not fulfill prophecy, but was written into them after the fact, what remains of his claim to legitimacy? What remains of the divine plan that billions were told to believe in? Nothing but smoke and mirrors. And reflect on this: if the very people who preserved those scriptures for centuries, the Jewish people, reject the Christian interpretation, then how can Christians insist that they are right and everyone else is wrong? Is it not more reasonable to see the gospel writers as opportunists weaving their myth into the sacred texts of another culture, using mistranslation and manipulation as tools of power? And here lies the emotional weight, because for so many believers the idea that Jesus was foretold gave them a sense of certainty, a sense that history was guided, that everything had meaning. But to realize that this certainty was manufactured is to feel betrayed at the deepest level. It is to realize that you were given illusions instead of truth, and once that curtain is pulled back, there is no going back, because prophecy was supposed to be the anchor, the unshakable evidence, and yet it crumbles under scrutiny, and when it crumbles, the story of Jesus is revealed not as destiny but as invention, and that realization is not just academic, it is existential, because it forces you to confront the uncomfortable reality that the figure who was supposed to be the fulfillment of divine promise was in fact the product of human imagination, and once you face that, you cannot unsee it. And this brings us to the even greater deception, the fifth lie, that Jesus was crucified under Pontius Pilate, a moment treated as the central historical fact of Christianity, yet one that collapses when you see the contradictions, the silence of history, and the political motives behind its invention, a lie so deep that once exposed, it leaves you asking if anything in the story was ever true at all. The fifth lie that has been drilled into the world's memory, as if it were the one certain historical event in the story of Jesus, is the crucifixion under Pontius Pilate. Because preachers and scholars will tell you, even if you doubt the miracles, even if you question the prophecies, at least you can be sure he was crucified. Yet the evidence that is supposed to prove this collapses under examination, because outside of the Gospels there is no contemporary Roman record of such an execution, no decree from Pilate, no mention in official documents, nothing in the archives of Rome where executions of rebels and criminals were recorded meticulously. And remember, the Romans crucified thousands of people and left detailed evidence of them, yet silence surrounds this most important death of all. So where does the idea come from? It comes only from the Gospels written decades later by communities that had already turned Jesus into a savior figure. And if you examine the accounts closely, you will see they do not agree. One Gospel describes Jesus silent before Pilate. Another shows him engaging in conversation. One has the crowd calling for his death. Another has Pilate reluctantly condemning him. And these contradictions are not small details. They reveal theological agendas. One writer wanted to blame the Jews more. Another wanted to exonerate Rome. Another wanted to present Jesus as a silent lamb. These are not eyewitness memories. They are crafted narratives. And think about this: if Pilate had truly executed a man hailed as King of the Jews, a man accused of threatening Rome, it would have been noted by Josephus, by Philo, by Tacitus in their records of Judea. Yet when they do mention Christians or Christ decades later, it is vague, suspiciously brief, and possibly tampered with, leaving us with no reliable historical anchor. So the crucifixion, far from being certain, stands on the same shaky ground as the rest of the story. And when you ask why invent such a scene, the answer is chilling. Because crucifixion was a political message. It framed Jesus not just as a victim, but as the ultimate martyr, the one who suffered the most humiliating and painful death possible, which made the story emotionally irresistible, because a savior who dies for you commands loyalty like no other. And it also allowed the gospel writers to connect Jesus to scriptures like Isaiah's suffering servant, creating the illusion of prophecy fulfilled. But if the event itself is unproven, then the theology built on it collapses. The cross becomes not a historical symbol but a propaganda tool, and you can see how powerful it was because empires rallied under it, wars were fought with it, billions carried it as a sign of hope. Yet what if the death it represents never happened? What if it was a fabrication woven into a myth to inspire obedience? What does that say about the institutions that demand you bow to that symbol? It says they manipulated you with the most powerful image of suffering imaginable, an execution story that may never have occurred. But even if you grant that perhaps a man was executed, does that prove he was Jesus? Does that prove he rose from the dead? No, it proves only that crucifixion was common, and attaching it to a mythical figure gave the story realism. And this is the final layer of deception, because once you realize the crucifixion itself is uncertain, everything else falls apart. The resurrection loses its foundation. The theology of atonement evaporates. The very heart of Christianity ceases to beat, and you are left staring at the chilling possibility that the most famous death in history never occurred, that it was written into existence by storytellers with an agenda. And this is the crushing truth they never wanted you to see, because if the crucifixion is a lie, then the entire religion built on it is exposed as fabrication. But now you see it. Now you know, and this knowledge cannot be taken from you. And as we close this fifth block, having exposed 5 colossal lies from the lack of historical evidence, to the false eyewitnesses, to the recycled miracles, to the twisted prophecies, to the fabricated crucifixion, you are standing at the edge of an irreversible truth, and if this has already shaken your perspective, then you must stay with us for what comes next, because the remaining 5 lies will strip away the final illusions, revealing the raw reality they have hidden for 2,000 years. So if this truth already shook you, imagine what comes next. Subscribe so you do not miss the full truth, because together we are going to uncover what the world was never supposed to know.